This is a fan-generated show. If you'd like to support us, please go to jamieglazov.com. Also, don't forget to subscribe to our new Rumble channel. All your support is greatly appreciated.
Good evening. Welcome to the Glazov Gang. Tonight we have a very special guest, and backed by popular demand, Robert Spencer, the director of Jihad Watch. He's a Shulman Fellow at the David Horowitz Freedom Center, the author of many, many books, the latest of which are The Critical Quran and The Sumter Gambit. Robert, welcome to the program.
Good to see you, Jamie. Thank you.
Is there anything I should have added for now in terms of your introduction?
Coming in November, Empire of God, How the Byzantines Saved Civilization. November 21st, available at all self-respecting bookstores. Of course, that's a little bit of ways away, but I want you to start getting excited about that.
What a great writer you are, Robert. I'm always impressed, but maybe amazed is the more correct word, at how smart you are and how quickly you get everything done. You're a great guy.
It's because of your tie. It inspires me.
Robert, sometimes we don't know where to start. What's been on your mind lately?
What's been on my mind? Well, I'm deeply concerned, of course, with the Biden regime's efforts to criminalize opposition and destroy dissent and make its point of view only the acceptable point of view that can be enunciated in the United States. I'm deeply concerned about all the efforts that go along with that and try to dilute and destroy our national character and unity by opening the border, by unrestricted mass migration, by bringing in thousands upon thousands of Afghan migrants, completely unvetted. We have no idea who they are, coming from a jihadi hotspot where Al-Qaeda, ISIS, and the Taliban are all active. So many things on my mind, Jamie, actually, and working on a new book, new critical biography of Muhammad. I wrote a biography of Muhammad back in 2006, but that just presents the main story of Muhammad from the key Islamic texts. And then I also wrote a book later called Did Muhammad Exist? This book, Muhammad, A Critical Biography, will bring the two together and show how the story of Muhammad developed as much as we can see that from this vantage point, and explaining why it, despite the devotion and reverence in which he is held by Muslims, why it actually has no historical value. And that'll be a book coming sometime in 2024. I have to turn it in later this year.
Please continue. I don't really have any questions.
I see. Well, all right. What else is there?
Well, I do have some questions. Robert, in terms of Muhammad, any new thoughts or discoveries or a perspective that maybe you didn't have 10, 20 years ago?
Well, I'm more convinced than ever that he's a mythical character, a legend. And what's really interesting, Jamie, actually, is that there are now people who are actual Islamic apologists who are starting to admit that the people who have been saying this were right all along. They're not going the whole way, of course, because that would mean they would have to stop being Muslim. But for example, there is an effort lately that I was just reading about before we started the show today, an effort to impugn the idea that Aisha, Muhammad's child bride, was actually 6 when he married her and 9 when he consummated the marriage or raped her. And then this, of course, is a very problematic passage for Muslims today in the West, because in the West it's taken for granted that child marriage is physically and psychologically harmful for girls, and that it's therefore to be discouraged. But when Muhammad does it, and he's the excellent example, as the Quran says in chapter 33, verse 21, then some Muslims will imitate it. And so all the girls from 3rd grade age up are married in Afghanistan. It would be very hard to find one that was not. And so that's a very dangerous thing. and a deleterious example that Muhammad is giving. So there is actually a new argument from some Islamic scholars and some non-Muslims, but it's been taken up by some Islamic scholars, that the stories that show that Aisha was a child are actually not historically accurate. Now, the funny thing about this, Jamie, is that the stories about Muhammad marrying a child are in Sahih Bukhari, which is the collection of hadith reports about Muhammad's words and deeds that Muslims generally consider most reliable. And if in Islamic law, if something is in Bukhari and it doesn't contradict the Quran, then it's ipso facto considered authentic. But now, because the Aisha material is so embarrassing to Muslims in the West, some are actually taking up the arguments that I used in Did Muhammad Exist to say that these are late, these are unreliable, these are not historically accurate, they come from 200 years after Muhammad, and so on. And that's fine, that's all true. I completely agree. The only problem is the people who do this, they're kind of boneheaded because they don't seem to realize that all the rest of the hadith material that gives us the great bulk of what we know or think we know about Muhammad is on the same level in terms of historical accuracy and reliability as the Aisha material. And so that means that when these Islamic apologists say that the Aisha material is late and unreliable, they're sort of like somebody sitting on a tree branch and cutting the branch off that they're sitting on. They don't seem to realize they're destroying the foundation of their faith itself by using these arguments to attack the Aisha hadith. I mean, how could they miss this? I don't know. It's entertaining to watch, but it's interesting to see how it will develop. And what's really noteworthy is that it is becoming more mainstream, both in the non-Muslim academic world and among Islamic spokesmen, to admit that the material that we have about Muhammad is not really historical records, but late legends from 200 years after he's supposed to have lived.
Fascinating. So ask yourself the next question and answer it.
You didn't tell me I would have to do this. I would have been prepared with all kinds of questions.
Okay, Robert, let's just fill in this puzzle here for a minute. This is so fascinating. What's a little bit of the evidence, share with our audience, of why Muhammad is a mythical character and may not have existed? A lot of things were written much, much later?
Not a lot, all. This is the situation, Jamie. Muhammad, according to Islamic tradition, was born in the year 570 AD and lived till 632 AD. And if you go to actual 7th century records written in the time he's supposed to have lived, there's no indication that anybody knew anything about it. Now, that's not all that damning in itself. There are many other figures, especially in the age before mass communication, many other famous people who were famous in a very small area and not known very far out of it. But right after this, right after 632, you have the Arab conquests of the Middle East and North Africa, Persia, parts of India, and so on. And according to the standard story, these were Muslims who were coming with the Quran and with the teachings of Muhammad and telling the people that they were conquering, that they were bringing this new religion, this new God, this new holy book, and this new prophet. But if you look at the available records from the 7th century, there is no hint that anybody has any idea that the conquerors, who are very real, have any new prophet or new religion or new holy book. There's no mention of it. There are a couple of scattered mentions of Muhammad, but none of them, zero, correspond to the picture we have of the Prophet of Islam from the 9th century Islamic material. We only meet that guy 200 years after he's supposed to have lived. And this is the problem. In the 800s, there's this huge explosion, a massive proliferation of stories about Muhammad. And so people say, well, you see, it's just because you live in a written culture, but they lived in an oral culture. It was all oral transmission before the 9th century. But the problem with that is that there's not even any reference. There's oral tradition in the New Testament. In the Acts of the Apostles, at one point, Jesus is quoted saying, "It is more blessed to give than to receive." There is no statement, "It is more blessed to give than to receive," in the Gospels. It was an oral tradition that somebody writes down, that it's written down, somebody remembers and is written down there in Acts. So you would expect, in the Islamic context, that all through the 7th century, if they've got all these oral traditions in their heads, that people are going to be saying, well, Muhammad said this. And when they come to a particular problem where there's a story of Muhammad that seems to solve it, then they'll quote Muhammad, even if we don't have the traditions all written down. And there's nothing like that at all. And so the incredible proliferation of the stories about Muhammad in the 9th century is the result of actual fabrication, that Muslims, by this time, there had begun to be writing about Muhammad as a prophet, and an effort by the leaders of the Arab Empire to create a new religion, to give unity to their empire. And so there started to be the practice of, somebody wanted to justify a behavior, somebody wanted to say that this ought to be done, then they would make up a story in which Muhammad did it or said it should be done. And so we get all this literature, but really it's about the factions in Islam. It's not really about Muhammad at all. That just doesn't go back. It's like it would be like if we're only hearing now about Thomas Jefferson, and there's no record of anything Thomas Jefferson said or did. But people know that Thomas Jefferson was a very important guy, so they start saying, well, Thomas Jefferson said this, and making up all these stories. And we would only have them from now. And so maybe in another 1,000 years, people will think, well, there really was a Thomas Jefferson who flew in Star Cruisers and said, "Beam me up, Scotty." But it would have no historical value and not be actually traceable to the time when he actually lived.
Robert, you presented this case very strongly in your book, Did Muhammad Exist? Aside from the accusations that you're a racist and an Islamophobe and a horrible person, can you name a person and the text where a very valid, strong counter-argument was made to what you were just saying?
I don't know of any strong counter-argument, Jamie. I've looked for it. Actually, I wrote Did Muhammad Exist back in, I guess it was 2010 or 11, and I just revised it last year, came out with an expanded version, because there were some new developments that I wanted to fit into the book. And in preparing the expanded edition, I looked for people who defend the traditional stories about Muhammad. And for example, and so I discussed them in the revised edition. Some people say, for example, that they point out that there really were historians in the 7th century who were keeping records of Muhammad. That's great, except we don't actually have any of those guys' writings. We only know about those people because of 9th century writings that mention them. And so while it may be true that they were real and that they transmitted stories of Muhammad, we have no way to be sure that those stories were not considerably altered before the time that they were written down, because we just don't have any. Like, for example, there's Ibn Ishaq, who wrote in the 760s, and that's the first big biography of Muhammad. But even that was based on the works of Urwa and others from before that. But we don't have any of those writings. We don't even have Ibn Ishaq. The only thing we have is Ibn Hisham, who wrote in the 830s, which is fully 200 years after Muhammad's death. And he incorporates a large section of Ibn Ishaq's writing, but we don't know how much he altered it. And he refers to some of these earlier people, but here again, we don't know how much these things were altered. And if you compare Ibn Hisham's writings with those of Waqidi, Waqidi is another 9th century historian who writes a biography of Muhammad. Waqidi often has a whole lot more detail and a whole lot more interesting little facts about the stories he tells. And the problem is he's later. than Ibn Hisham. And so, did he have access to sources that were more detailed than Ibn Hisham? Probably not. Probably what happened was he is coming along at a later stage of the development of these legends when they're filling the stories out and putting more detail in them to make them seem realistic.
So, Robert, if there are some people who want to wage jihad on non-Muslims, just kind of put that in there, like kill the unbelievers and, smite them at their necks, cut their head off. And, oh, it might be nice to rape the women too. Oh, captives of the right hand, get that in there. And if you're not wearing hijab, you get to be molested. And we might want to throw in some 9-year-old girls in there. Yeah, well, let's create Aisha. Maybe there's some pedophiles and homosexuals there too. Hey, let's throw in the little boys that will be in heaven, the scattered pearls of eternal freshness, or however that was described. There's a large chance that the people who wanted to do all these sick and terrible things, they just manufactured and created all of this?
Yeah, exactly. If they wanted to do something and they didn't want any flack from other people, then they put it in the mouth of Muhammad and said, Muhammad, the prophet, said that this was fine, or he married the 6-year-old, or whatever they wanted to justify.
So then Khomeini married a 10-year-old girl, and guess what he gets to say?
Muhammad did it. He's imitating Muhammad. It's a pious act.
So what does all of this mean, Robert? This must be, I think it would be an understatement to say this is devastating to members of this particular quote-unquote religion.
Yeah, it certainly is. Obviously, Islam, like Christianity, is a historical faith. It makes historical claims. And if Muhammad never was there at all, and then he didn't receive a revelation from Allah, and the Quran is not from God and is not the perfect book that existed forever in paradise, then there's no reason to be Muslim. There's no Islam. And so it's a very serious question. And this is why, coming back to what I was discussing at the beginning, it's just extraordinary that Islamic apologists are having recourse to this to try to get out of their Aisha problem, because they don't realize, I don't know how they could miss this, but maybe they think they can somehow figure out a way to throw Aisha out and keep the rest. But it's all on the same level in terms of historical value. And so once they start acknowledging that it's late and legendary, they're going to end up having to acknowledge that all of it is late and legendary, and then they won't have any Islam left.
But in terms of Islamic scholars and the people, let's just say, that would defend the existence of Muhammad and Islam, etc., you have yet to be confronted by any serious criticism or evidence, correct?
That's right, yeah.
What do? They just ignore you?
Yeah, mostly. And then those who say something, they say, well, you're lying. And of course, I know I'm not lying, and I ask them to find the lie, and then they go silent. Or else...
Well, you're also Islamophobic. You're afraid of something that doesn't exist.
Well, yeah. They also say, how could you have written the truth about Muhammad, that's the biography, and then turn around and say he didn't exist? Well, actually, it's no contradiction at all, because the truth about Muhammad tells the stories, and then the Did Muhammad Exist book examines the historical value of the stories. And the new book will do even more of both of those things. But the idea, a lot of the answer is just that they refuse to even consider the evidence and say, of course, there's the Muhammad existed. I remember I debated Anjem Chowdhury along with David Wood. We debated Anjem Chowdhury and Omar Bakri, the two notorious imams in Britain, although Bakri is no longer in Britain. And this was years ago. And Chowdhury just said, of course Muhammad existed. It's in the Quran. And that was all he had. That was as far as he was going to go in terms of his analysis question. And others will say, oh, no, we have all these stories, and we have the chains of transmission that show that the story was passed on from this reliable person to the next reliable person, and they refuse to accept the possibility that those chains of transmission can be fabricated just as easily as the stories themselves.
This is absolutely incredible. how have the Muslim reformers been treating you, and what's going on with them lately? What's the story on them?
Well, I don't know. I've always been open to collaboration or cooperation, or at least friendly relations with genuine Muslim reformers. But a lot of the Muslim reformers, of course, are fake.
Yeah.
They're liars who try to fool people who are not Muslim into thinking that Islam doesn't really teach warfare and subjugation, child marriage, and polygamy, and everything else that makes it unpopular to people in the West today. And
Yeah.
those people are just liars. And so I have no respect for them, and they don't like me particularly because I shine a light on their deceptions. There is maybe a small number of Muslim reformers who are genuine and sincere, but they've generally kept their distance. I think that their hostility is probably due to the fact that they're trying to maintain the appearance of being Muslim, and there's such hostility toward me in the Islamic world. They don't want to appear friendly because it will impugn their Islamic authenticity. But of course,
Yeah.
their Islamic authenticity is kind of under a cloud to begin with, because they are denying what are very clear and obvious tenets of the mainstream faith.
Yeah. There's a certain percentage of these individuals that I have been in contact with, that I've studied, I've thought about. There's a certain element there, Robert, where I think that these particular reformers, they stumbled upon the reality that this is all a lie. If I leave, there's this thing called apostasy laws, and probably will get killed. So let me be a reformer, right?
Yeah, that's probably true of some. Absolutely.
Fascinating stuff. Robert, let's move over to the FBI and what's going on right now. The Durham report, what that told us in terms of the element of the FBI whistleblowers and what they're telling, including about January 6th. Let's just move back for a minute, just on a personal level with you. Many years ago, there was somebody coming to attack you and Pamela Geller at an event, and they were being egged on to actually engage in behavior that would hurt you and Pamela. And then you found out that the people who were egging them on were FBI. One could draw quite a conclusion from this.
Oh, I've drawn it. Jamie, that was what do you young folks call it? A red pill? That was a massive red pill for me, in terms of waking me up to the fact that the FBI was not a selfless group of patriotic law enforcement officials who were resistant to corruption and trying to work in the best interests of the American people. Now I realize that the FBI is desperately corrupt, probably irredeemably corrupt, deeply politicized, much more interested in fulfilling the in creating the illusion of the reality rather than dealing with reality as it is. What happened was, Pamela Geller and I sponsored a Muhammad art exhibit and cartoon contest on May 3rd, 2015 in Garland, Texas. And the idea of this was to demonstrate, after the killings of the Muhammad cartoonists at the Charlie Hebdo magazine in Paris earlier in 2015, that we were going to stand and defend the freedom of expression. That the freedom of speech, the freedom of expression, these are the foundations of any free society. If you don't have them, then the tyrant can do whatever he wants, and you can't say anything about the tyrant. And so you have to have the freedom of expression, and one of the foremost enemies, but not by no means the only enemy of the freedom of expression in America today, is Islam. It's Islamic law, which forbids criticism of Islam. And you get this towering rage, this murderous rage from some Muslims if you draw Muhammad. And so we thought, if you're going to threaten to kill us for drawing Muhammad, then we actually have to draw Muhammad. Not because we care to draw Muhammad or because we want to mock your prophet, but because if we submit to bullying, if we acquiesce to violent intimidation on this point, then we're only going to encourage you to give us more violent intimidation. until finally you have us completely on our knees doing your bidding by threatening to kill us. And so that was the rationale behind the contest. A couple of ISIS guys from the Islamic Community Center of Phoenix drove 8 hours to Garland, Texas to kill us all. And there was an FBI informant who was in touch with them. But the FBI did not notify our security people that there was a threat to the event. And so that was one thing. The FBI informant was also talking to the killers and encouraging them, as you noted, said, tear up Texas, telling them they should do this. They should come in and kill us all. And the FBI had no people on the ground, none, in the event or around the event to try to prevent us all from being massacred. The only thing was that Pamela and I had hired a large number of security people. And so when the guys got there and drew their guns and shot one of our guys, then they themselves were shot and killed. And so that's why there weren't 300 people massacred and why we are having this conversation today instead of my dying in 2015. But the FBI was all on the side of the shooters. And they have completely stonewalled. We submitted some requests for information, and they ignored us entirely. And then came out, there was a trial involved with some of the plotters who survived, and the informant actually showed up and testified and gave this ridiculously implausible story about how he wasn't really encouraging them. He was just saying to them what they might do if they got to our event, which of course, that's just silly beyond measure. And of course, now we know that the FBI tried to frame and destroy first a presidential candidate and then a sitting president of the United States, that Biden, Merrick Garland, Christopher Wray, and others have all repeatedly said that white supremacists constitute the biggest terror threat to America today. And so FBI agents have actually been pressured, according to whistleblowers, to classify cases as white supremacist terrorism, even when there was no element of that in the case, to exaggerate cases, to even fabricate material to make it look as if this is a white supremacist threat. I also think the FBI is behind things like the Patriot Front. Just the other day, Joe Biden spoke at Howard University, a historically Black university, and he said, I always say it everywhere I go, white supremacy is the biggest terror threat. And then the next day, or maybe even the same day, you have 200 members of this alleged neo-Nazi group, this alleged white supremacist group, marching in Washington. They're all dressed in the same way. They're all young, fit men. I've seen real neo-Nazis on occasion on video. I've never seen one in the flesh, but in videos and pictures of various rallies and such. And you usually have some fat guys, some old guys, some guys look like losers that live in their mom's basement, things like that. And these were all young, trim, military grade young men. You got to think, it's hard not to think, oh, these guys have to meet the FBI fitness standards, or the fitness standards of some other intelligence agency. They all have their faces covered. And I think the biggest indication that they were a false front is that the police would not arrest them, did not bother them, and actually cordoned off the subway when they went down into the subway and left, and did not let people follow them. So why are they protecting these guys? And then there are pictures that some of them did actually get arrested, supposedly, but they still have their masks on. Now, it's basic police protocol, even I know this, that if somebody's masked, you arrest them, you take off the mask. So for the purposes of identification. But the police are clearly protecting the identities of these people, not showing any curiosity about who or what they are, and not letting other people get close to them either. And meanwhile, they all fit the MO of undercover people from a federal agency. And you hear them speak, it sounds like what some not very well-educated leftist would imagine would be a good speech for a right-wing white supremacist leader to give. But it was really kind of tone deaf and clunky, vague, and ill composed. And so anyway, that's speculation, but the rest of it is not. It's very clear from the Russian collusion hoax and many other things, from the classification of parents protesting at school board meetings as domestic terrorists, from much more, that the FBI needs to be shut down, probably the building destroyed and the ground sowed with salt. Once we get the records out, we need to know what they've been up to, and to know the full story of their corruption. I don't know that this will ever happen, but if we're going to survive as a nation, the FBI and the CIA have to go.
Disturbing stuff during a disturbing time. We're going to take a quick break with our sponsors.
Hello, I'm Mike Lindell. Years ago, when I invented MyPillow, I was faced with every adversity you could think of. No retailers wanted to sell MyPillow. That's come full circle. Vendors took advantage of me, and I was copied by China. Well, by the grace of God, I was able to get through all that and learn from it. I have a passion to help other U.S. entrepreneurs, and that's why I created my new platform, mystore.com. We have hundreds of products from amazing entrepreneurs, and to celebrate, I'm going to put my pillows on mystore.com right now. You can get my standard My Pillows regularly $69.98, now only $19.98 with your promo code. Or you can get my standard queen size, regular $79.98, now only $29.98. Or you can get my premium king size, regularly $89.98, now only $34.98. So go to mystore.com and use that promo code on your screen to get huge discounts on all My Store products. Thank you and God bless.
And we are back with the great one and only Robert Spencer. Before the break, we were discussing the problem of the FBI. Robert, but there does seem to be some hope in terms of all the corruption in the FBI, because the FBI is lately having some kind of a smiling day.
Yeah, see, this is another thing. The FBI is completely sold out to the prevailing, what is known as woke culture, which is really just sort of a cultural Marxism of a watered down variety. The happiness seminar is just psychobabble. It's ridiculous time wasting on the taxpayer dime, when the feds certainly have, if they were a real law enforcement agency and a real intelligence agency, they'd have plenty to do to occupy their time. But I suppose they're tired after framing the president and fabricating right-wing supremacist terror threats, and so they need to take a little break with their happiness seminar.
Robert, what do you make of what the whistleblowers and a lot of other evidence reveals about January 6th? What conclusion can we reach in terms of a lot coming at us now?
I think it's very clear, Jamie, January 6th was another hoax, that there were FBI informants, we know. We don't know exactly how many, but you look at Ray Epps. I mean, Ray Epps is the classic example, that there's the one guy out of all those people who were there, the one guy who's on video saying, we need to go into the Capitol, and not saying it once, but not saying it twice, but repeatedly saying this and being caught on video. And not only is he not in solitary confinement, not being held without trial, not being persecuted like a lot of the people who were led in by the police and strolled into the Capitol, not having any idea they were doing anything wrong, took some selfies and left. Instead of that, you have this guy not arrested and protected by the media with puff pieces in the New York Times and from 60 Minutes, saying that he's being persecuted by right-wing conspiracy theorists. You couldn't be clearer. This guy was a provocateur. I don't know if he was FBI or some other agency. They keep denying that he was FBI. And I think that's the cover, okay? He probably wasn't FBI. He was probably a member of one of the other intelligence agencies. And he is there to try to stir people up and get them into the Capitol so that they can then turn around and say there was this insurrection, this plot to overthrow the government. There's never been a plot found. There's never been plotters found, weapons, ringleader, nothing. The closest thing to a ringleader you got is Ray Epps, and his story stinks very badly. But it's clear in all kinds of ways. You know, Trump is saying in his speech on January 6th, proceed peacefully and patriotically, and then they try to frame him as leading the insurrection. Well, how do you lead the insurrection when you say be peaceful? And you're supposed to be at the same time fomenting a violent insurrection. It doesn't even make the basic amount of sense. It doesn't make any sense on a basic level. It's silly. And yet, of course, it's instrumentalized by this authoritarian regime, by this anti-freedom, anti-American regime that wants to criminalize dissent. They want to use it as kind of a Reichstag fire moment. Hitler used the burning down of the Reichstag in Berlin as his pretext to say the Republic is under threat. To save the Republic, you got to give me dictatorial powers. And they did. Now, it's going to be the same thing here. They have to move more slowly because, unlike Germany, we have a 200-year tradition of having a free republic and real dissent in the society and real opposition. And so to destroy opposition, they have to go a little more slowly. But that is definitely what they're working for. There's simply no doubt about it. Joe Biden has already said in his ominous red and black speech from September 1st, 2022, that Donald Trump and the MAGA Republicans are a threat to the very foundations of the Republic. There's never been a president who said that about his chief opponent and half of the electorate before. And what he's saying is that Trump and his supporters are outside the bounds of what's acceptable political discourse in the United States. What he wants to do is narrow those bounds until the only acceptable political discourse you can have in the United States is what agrees with the left. And that will be the end of the Republic. We're very, very close to it at this point.
And I think we're already there in the sense that if you disagree with any leftist agenda, you are a white supremacist, terrorist, transphobic, Islamophobic, homophobe.
Yes, indeed. And actually, this initiative was honed and perfected in the fight against what is called Islamophobia. Right after 9/11, when I and some other people were saying, actually, it is Islam. Actually, Islam does teach this kind of thing. Actually, we need to be looking into the teachings of Islam in order to understand why this happened, why 9/11 happened. And the president of the United States said, no, Islam is peace. And the people who said this, me and many others, who said, no, Islam is not peace, and we should speak truthfully about it, were branded as Islamophobes and stigmatized, demonized, marginalized, and silenced as a result. And as it turns out, that was just a dry run. These people are terrorists. We heard, about dry runs in the time after 9/11. People would say there was a disturbance on an airplane and some Saudis were trying to open one of the airplane windows. And I remember reading about that incident in particular and people saying, oh, it was a dry run. They wanted to see how people would react. And so the branding of Islamophobes and the creation of the concept of Islamophobia turns out to have been a dry run to brand the half of the population of the United States as white supremacists, terrorists, domestic extremists, and in first place, silence them accordingly, and then to criminalize their behavior.
Very, very sobering times, Robert. I think that there's a spiritual battle occurring right before our eyes. I don't want to impose any of this on you. Perhaps we have some different beliefs. And in my own world, I think about a lot of prophecies, not just in the New Testament. Also, we have some apparitions by Mary and the Fatima, the third secret of Fatima, and lots of other things. There's an accumulation of prophecies about the end times, of a falling away from the church, of a great apostasy. And if one believes that, it does make a little bit of sense, to say the least, in terms of when we look at somebody like Pope Francis, when we see what's happening not only in the world, but within the Catholic Church itself. And if Satan wanted to infiltrate God's church, the Catholic Church. He's doing a pretty good job, I would say an excellent job, as has been prophesied. I mean, as Christians, we also have faith and we celebrate constantly because we know Jesus' death and resurrection is a reality and eternal, and we have salvation through him. And the darker things get, we need not to be troubled by these things, because these things should come to pass, as Jesus told us, and the satanic forces will not prevail in the end against the church or in any other way. But there is a certain time where things will get dark in this way. And what I'm getting to here is an article that you wrote, and in your other work, but very recently, in a Catholic church in New York City, they had a God is trans exhibit. Speaking about a spiritual war, tell us a little bit about that.
Well, in the first place, I just thought I'd broaden it out a bit, because I myself am not a Catholic, and I know that there are probably a lot of people who are watching who are not as well. That
Yeah.
I think I certainly agree with you 100% that this is a spiritual war, that there's a deep spiritual aspect to it. And you can look actually at the Judeo-Christian tradition in a larger sense, at the very beginning in Genesis, where one of the first things that God says about human beings, if not the first thing, is male and female, he created them. And I think that that is one of the reasons why the whole concept of being male and female is under such severe attack today. Attack like there's never been in human history before. And it's because this is a battle against God and against these deep intrinsic spiritual values that are larger than Christianity, larger than Judaism and Christianity, the identity of human beings themselves as male and female. It's to try to reject that and to go to war against it is to go to war against the most basic realities of human existence. And that means it's at its core, it's a war against the Creator who made those realities. But anyway, in terms of the article that I wrote about the church, they're going in exactly the opposite direction and making an idol in their own image. And so they are obsessed with this gender bending, these delusions and fantasies that men can become women and women can become men. And as a result, they're making a God out of that and saying that God is trans. Now, they don't have the slightest clue of the implications of what they're saying, because in the first place, it's been a common element of Judaism and Christianity, as well as other religious traditions, to say that God or the divine is, in the first place, is perfect, is the summit of what we are as human beings. And no human being can attain that same perfection. But what they're saying is that God is radically imperfect, that God is so imperfect that he's going to transform into something else, and thus hates himself in the same way that the trans people are deluded and hating themselves and thinking that they'll be able to find their true identity or true happiness by mutilating themselves and butchering what they are coming from God and transforming themselves into something else. Now, a God that would do that is not a God, because a God that would need to make such mutilation of himself is obviously a radically imperfect being. And so it's idolatry in the classic sense, what they're doing in this church. And it's kind of scandalous that it is happening in a Catholic church that is supposed to be a monotheistic religion. And even Pope Francis, for all the suspect things that he said about so many things, so many issues, he has come out strongly to say that transgenderism is a delusion and something that should not be encouraged. And so it'll be interesting to see if any action is taken against this church, or if it will just be allowed to go alone.
Right. I think that's probably just a little stage for him, because on a lot of other issues connected to this totalitarian satanic movement in terms of LGBTQ and all that stuff, he's done some very suspect things. But anyway, this is not a satanic cult doing this on this occasion. This is the Church of St. Paul the Apostle, a Roman Catholic parish on Manhattan's Upper West Side. Quite a interesting development, one could say, right?
Yeah, that's for sure. It's the home, the international home of the Paulist Fathers. And I'm somewhat familiar with them. I know that they're a very leftist group within the church. And so it's clear that there's just no limit to how far left they'll go. As the secular culture goes, they will follow. And so they don't have any convictions of their own or any commitment even to their own stated faith. They just follow the trends of the larger leftist establishment culture.
Robert, we just have a few minutes left to hear your wisdom and observe your courage and your genius. I was a little bit surprised by one of your pieces recently because for me, AOC, just so brilliant and so wise and just so courageous and smart and noble. And you wrote that AOC should resign from Congress in disgrace today. Now, why did you say that?
She should have done it. I wrote that a few days ago, and I'm sorry she's not gone. But I didn't really expect she would resign on my word. But it's a shame. It's a sign of how far we've degenerated in terms of the American public debate, that nobody of any power and influence is calling for AOC to resign. This is what the situation is. She had a staffer, a paid staffer, as part of her campaign, who is an open Marxist. And now that staffer has left her office and is leader of the New York Communist Party. Now, that's really sort of commonplace on the left today. AOC calls herself a socialist, and Bernie Sanders is a socialist. But Bernie has been confronted about this, and he himself has said, I'm talking about the socialism of Sweden and Denmark, not the socialism of the Soviet Union and Moscow. And so...
That's a great impression, Robert. You should have went into another profession.
Yes, politics. I'd be senator from Vermont. Anyway, so the thing is, though, that if AOC is also, and I'm sure she would say the same thing if she were asked, that she wants the soft socialism of Sweden and not the hard socialism of the Soviet Union, then she still should never have had this staffer, because the staffer has even said openly that it won't go well for the people who are against the workers when we have our communist state. And so she's threatening a reign of terror, more or less openly. Now, imagine if AOC had a staffer who had been a Nazi and who left AOC's staff to go be the head of the New York Nazi Party. AOC would have been made to resign already. It wouldn't even be an issue. But Marxists, communists, we don't have a problem. And yet, Marxism and Nazism are just as violent and inhumane, both of them together. They are anti-human, deeply bloodthirsty, vicious, violent creeds. And one of them is not significantly worse than the other. And so if we would never stand for having a congressman who has a Nazi on staff, then AOC should resign.
And AOC supports an ideology, and this ex-aide of hers that supports this ideology, is involved with this ideology. This ideology of class hatred took about 100 million lives in the 20th century, and that's a conservative figure.
He honeymooned in Moscow in the 1980s when there was still the Soviet Union.
Robert, it's still not too late to start this new profession. I'm very impressed. Robert, we got to go. What an honor and a privilege to have you here. I joke around with you a lot, but I just want to take this last 20 seconds on a very serious note. Look, I've known you, I think, for more than 2 decades now. Life goes by very quickly. Thank you for being such a noble and courageous truth teller in a world of lies. I have a lot of respect for you, and keep up the good work and the vital work. God bless you, Robert.
Likewise, you too, sir. All the same to you.
Thank you so much. But wait 1 second. We might have lots of people on the edge of their seat right now, and they might be new to some things. Where can they come and find you?
Jihadwatch.org, still going on. JIHADwatch.org. We also have the left column now where we track some of the left's attempts to encroach upon our freedoms. I'm at JihadWatchRS on Twitter, constantly arguing with people. And the books are still at Amazon for now, at Barnes & Noble, and anywhere fine books are sold.
Fantastic. And you will consider maybe doing videos of more impressions in the future, right?
Yeah, you know, I'm going to talk to Bernie Sanders. We're going to have some very high-level meetings, and I think that you're going to be happy with the result.
Okay. Thank you very much, Robert.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for watching the Glazov Gang this evening. We'll see you soon. Good night.